Hi, everyone, and good morning and welcome. I'm Rebecca Friedman, the director of the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab at FIU. Welcome today to episode 1 of season 2 of Coffee and Conversations, Museums and Histories of Anti-Blackness. We began this project at the start of the pandemic and the quarantine some months ago, in order to understand how cultural institutions were handling the changes before us at that time. The pandemic, however, is not at all isolated, as we know. Rather, as we continue to see calls against anti-Black violence, we acknowledge the overlapping pandemics of today, deeply rooted in the past. Today we launch this new season. As we launch this new season, we'll begin our discussions by emphasizing the significance of centering Black lives and experiences in museums and cultural institutions, and the challenges of working against the powers at those institutions, and the field of public history or society more generally, that have historically sought to erase, marginalize, or whitewash Black histories and experiences. And today I have the great honor and pleasure to kick off season 2 with Timothy A. Barber, the executive director of the Black Archives since August of 2009. He has also served on the City of Miami Historic and Environmental Preservation Board, where he's a past chair and currently presides as an active board member. Under Barber's guidance, the Black Archives opened the historic Ward Cultural Tourist Gallery through the City of Miami Community Redevelopment Agency. The gallery showcases rotating exhibits highlighting the accomplishments of Blacks in Miami. I could not be more excited to welcome Mr. Barber today. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm certainly glad to be here.
Yeah, it's great, thank you. So the format, as we were talking about, is simple. He and I will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the audience for the remaining 10 minutes at the end. And at any time, the audience can submit a question just using the Q&A chat button at the bottom of the screen. So welcome, Tim, and thank you again for being here. So let's get started.
All right.
I guess I would like to just start with a pretty general question. If you can describe for our audience a bit about the work that you do, and tell us about the Black Archives and its relationship to the Lyric Theater.
Well, you had an extensive amount of information on me. The Black Archives, I'm the executive director of the Black Archives. The Black Archives has been an established organization since 1977. The Black Archives is a research repository, photographic and manuscript research repository, which I actually joined the Black Archives as an intern in 2003. I guess worked my way up from being an assistant archivist, intern, archivist, curator, and the director. The Black Archives was started by our founder, which is the great Dr. Dorothy Jenkins Fields. And it was in the 1970s, and of course, during the Black Power movement. There's nothing new under the sun. We're still trying to continue to get our rights and things of that nature. But during that period in the mid-70s, Dr. Fields was a school librarian at Myrtle Grove Elementary. And she knew about all of the history that was in Miami. A lot of times we hear about the national history. We hear about Martin Luther King, we hear about Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey. But the information about our local success of people of color was not portrayed well here in South Florida. So she, being a school librarian at Myrtle Grove, which was an all-white school, she looked to get information from the main library on Blacks in South Florida. And when she called and let the librarian know that she was from Myrtle Grove, she was the librarian at Myrtle Grove, and she was trying to get information on people of color in Miami, the librarian put her on hold. After a few moments, came back to the phone and said the only thing that they have at the main library on Blacks were obituaries. And that librarian went further to state that, I guess those people don't think enough of themselves to collect their own history. Not thinking that Dr. Fields was one of those people. And that led her to begin to collect information, prominent information on people of color, to create this community, this archives in a community setting. And some 40 plus years later, we are here with manuscripts, a very large collection, being one of the major repositories in the South on the history of Miami. Now, our associations to the historic lyric theater is that. I like to say it's like the chicken and which came first, the chicken or the egg, right? So many people see the lyric theater and want to be enamored by the historic lyric theater, which was built by a Black man in 1913. Jeter Walker is the oldest performing arts center in Miami. It predates what we know as the Olympia Theater, which is the Gusman. The Gusman was done in 1925. The lyric was done in 1913. And it was here in the middle of what we know today as Overtown, but which is Colored Town. Now, why do I say what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Many people look at the lyric, they see the lyric today, and many people are enamored by the lyric and the glitz and glamour, but they're not aware that it was the collection that saved the lyric and not the lyric that saved the archives. And it was through the collections of the archives, the information that Dr. Fields began to collect. It was shortly after the Neville Johnson riots in 1982, December 1982, was that Dr. Fields began to do an assessment with other pioneers like Athlete Range and Wilhelmina Jenkins and all those persons that were on her board, to do an assessment of the buildings that did not suffer the consequences of the result of the riot over the murder of Neville Johnson. So that led to saving this building, that led to saving the Lyric Theater, where many people saw the theater as a church. Even though it was a performing arts center in 1913, by the time we got to 1970s, people only remembered it as being the old movie theater and then also being this church. And we believe that that was one of the main reasons why the theater didn't get knocked down when they built the Miami Arena, because the city thought it was a church, and you try to save church religion and things of that nature. So this led to Dr. Fields getting the Lyric and other buildings on the National Register of Historic Places, because the city of Miami wasn't allowing the designation of Black landmarks. So she had to go to, normally when you do historic buildings, you save it on a local level, then it goes to a state level, and then eventually goes to national level. That's a lot of times the normal trend, the traditional trend. But because the city was not allowing for the designation of Black landmarks, she went national and put it on a national register. That allowed her to get the funding that was needed to restore the original theater. And once she restored the original theater, found that there were some auxiliary spaces that were needed to upgrade from being in the 1900s to being now in the early 1900s to now being in the late 1900s, 1999, which was the first restoration. She was able to get funding from the state to restore it, and she was able to get funding from the county to do the first phase. And we're in the last phase, which under my tenure, we were able to build out and bring the archives, which was located at the Brownsville Joseph Caleb Center since its inception, get the archives to be located here, which in turn created the Black Archives Historic Lyric Theater Cultural Arts Complex. So that's the association of the archives and the Lyric Theater. I come from Florida A&M University, and I'm so used to working at the Carnegie Library, which was a historic library on Florida A&M's campus that housed the archives. So the association, since we're not a traditional archive that associated with a university, it was important that we associated the archives with a historic landmark, because, we educate, we entertain and educate. So people like entertainment, but a lot of people don't support education. So if you're supporting the Lyric Theater, in turn, you're supporting education by the archives. Sorry for the long story.
Oh, please, no apologies. So interesting, and I'm absolutely sure that's a history most people do not know. I certainly did not know that, so I really appreciate that. Fascinating. So I wonder if you would talk with us a little bit about this moment in terms of the pandemic, just to start off. And how would you suggest, you told me when we were chatting ahead of time that you've actually been coming into the office since March, which is stunning, incredibly committed. If you would talk a little bit about how the Black archives have changed and how your work has changed since March, and how can audiences best support you during this time of uncertainty for so many cultural institutions?
Yes.
And as you answer that, if I could just tag one more on.
Oh, no, you're fine. Go ahead.
All right. Can you talk a little bit about the programming that you have planned in the immediate future for the summer and then also in the near future, maybe into the fall, and whether it's changed in response to recent events?
That is a lot. Okay.
I know that's a handful.
So
Yeah.
you know, yeah, as I stated, when this pandemic hit, I was just coming off vacation. I was out of the country, coming back in, and there was this fear that they were not going to allow us to come in, whether they was going to close the border. So, you know, as soon as I got back into the United States, you know, immediately I had to hit the ground running with these fears of the unknown, these changes where they were starting to shut down the county and the country per se. So it was a traumatizing time, and it still is, because we're still deep in this thing of this pandemic. And, you know, for a cultural institution, it was very bad, and it still is, because we depend on dollars, cultural dollars, which is not the easiest money to attract. We had this theater, and we were seeming to just get ourselves running and going. We just reopened about 2014. We were just building an audience. We had programming happening from the amateur night that we do. We just opened a comedy night here at the theater. We were just getting our archival programming going and getting staff in. And March happened. You know, this pandemic happened, and so immediately we had to abide by CDC guidelines, send everyone home. You know, because it's just, people did not know much about what this virus. So it was very difficult to ascertain what exactly we should do. There was no Bible. There's nothing scripted as to what to do from a cultural nonprofit. Must say that a not for profit independent organization. So immediately we wanted to think about the safety of our employees. My safety of the employees. I came in and met with the employees, and at that point, told everybody to go home and wait further instructions. And at that point, because we were knee deep in everything, and I was just getting in, I had to stay. You know, because it was very important to keep operations going. Bills need to be paid. Things were coming in through the mail. Phone calls were coming in still. So, you know, being a small organization, some people just don't understand. As executive director, you have to do everything. You know, it isn't, we're not fortunate to have a director of media, you know, director of the bathrooms. We don't have all of that. So I had to become that. And I did, like I told you, I did a makeshift office on our first floor inside the security area. You know, people joke around down there, because I was doing video meetings down there and everything. And when you come into the front door, everything's laid out there. You know, you have the media room where I was going on live doing things, and I had my office over here. I had a video room where I was transferring data. So that was the issue. Now, what has changed, because we are a repository, and we not only doing entertainment where people are buying tickets to come to the historic theater, we're not only doing tours, we're also receiving researchers that are doing books, that are doing exhibits, that are doing publications and things of that nature. All of that ceased to happen. And of course, it affected us greatly. So what we had to do was figure out, how do we stay relevant during these times. We were dealing with a pandemic, but we were not dealing with a systemic racism with the George Floyd incident. Although this was going on, I like the saying that I saw on social media that racism didn't just begin. it's only being videoed right now. It's only being recorded. You know, the world is smaller now, so these cameras are making it more accessible to people. So we had to figure out how do we stay relevant at the time during this pandemic. One thing we knew that we had to begin to do was, so just like you began this social media broadcast, we started creating what we called a Safer at Home virtual series, where we had to remain relevant to our constituents, to our members, to our patrons. So what we did was each staff was to give each of them a day to do a broadcast. So one broadcast we do is called Legacies on Profiles in Black History. We do one of our staff members do an event called Is It True? Tales from the Magic City, where she dispels myths and rumors and things of that nature. We do a Jeopardy Noir, which I host, which we do Black history. And sometimes we do an event called the Black Card Experience, where we are, dealing with Black topics. We do Today in Black History, and we also do Story Times in Color. So we created these series of events and virtual tours on Friday. So each day had something for someone to do. First thing I had to do was figure out how do I continue to keep my employees paid. That was one of the changes that I wanted to ensure that my staff, although we're feeling the brunt of this pandemic, I did not want to hurt my staff through economics, through their life, health, work. So I began to look at my books and see how how long I can keep my staff being paid so that they don't have to worry about employment. So once I figured that out, because not one person on my staff has missed the check. I'm proud to say that we haven't been there, and that's difficult for a nonprofit. Then what we began to do is to create this online programming that changed everything. We also started a Lyric Live living room edition, where our host for our Lyric Live show and the DJ takes on something on Friday nights, where they're asking people to come online and express their talent on Instagram. So we did these things to just stay relevant, to keep things going, like everyone is doing. Finding ways that this computer generation. I say this all the time, and in my class when I teach history at Florida Memorial University, I always say that Christopher Columbus made the world small. Television made the world smaller. Telephone made the world even smaller, and cell phones just made the world super small, and computers just brought us all neck to neck. So this technology that is in front of us from an archival standpoint that is non-traditional for us, we had to make it traditional. With the meetings, with these social media things, with staying relevant. Now, it didn't increase our income generating, because we didn't want people to be burdened down, because everybody's feeling the effects. So we wanted to make these things free for people to participate on. It was good because it has allowed us to really venture out. Now, one thing that we're noticing is that as people begin to go back to work and to norm, the numbers in viewership is going down, because our programs happen around 11, 12, 1 or 2 o'clock, which was midday. When we first started, we was getting like 60 to 100 people video watching it. So now the numbers are like around 20, 18 on Facebook and stuff like that, because we know that people are finding other alternatives to do, since they're able to go out now. So we're looking at whether or not we want to move our programming to the evenings, when people are home, more home. So we're just gauging that. And right away, as soon as we was getting our foot in the ground, we had the George Floyd incident. We had the Breonna Taylor incident. We had these social injustices that began to be put on Front Street. But there's nothing new under the sun, because these things have happened before. When you talk about the Selma, crossing of the Petty Bridge, the media, the whole world saw them sicking dogs and spraying people that were fighting for the civil rights with water hoses, treating them inhumane. So here we are again with a platform that the world is seeing. the inhumane treatment of people of color, and it isn't just black; it's all brown, you know, Latino. Everyone has felt the brunt of this type of systemic racism in terms of policing. So now we had to switch gears, and I'm gonna stop and see if there's anything else that you wanted to add, a question to ask, because now we're switching gears because as a black institution, we're addressing these black issues yet again. It was Joseph, the late Reverend Joseph Laurie, who we just lost, I believe, this year. Joseph Laurie stated one time when I was in Birmingham, he said, Barber, let me ask you something. If you don't know where you come from, you will what? I said, well, you'll never know where you're going. He said, no, Barber, you'll never know when they're trying to take you back. So it's very important historically. And I saw our illustrious 45 just say something like, oh, you don't need to know your history. But the point of that is understanding what we have come through and continue to build on that will keep us from always having to start from the ground floor. And history does that for you. History does that when you understand the ground floor and you build up and never fall back to the ground floor, you begin to see progress. So I'm going to yield. Did I answer those questions? That was a lot of questions I tried to address in that.
I mean, come on, you addressed them and more.
All right.
I appreciate, and in fact, you anticipated my next question while you were at it, because I was going to ask you, but you began for sure to answer it. In this environment, changing or otherwise, certainly changed by social media, as you suggest, all of the anti-Black violence, police brutality, and so forth. If you could say a couple of words, you've already suggested how you're responding from your position, but could you say a little bit about what role you imagine cultural institutions have in general in this moment? Not so much because we've never been here before, but because we're here now in a new way, as you said, because of computers, because of social media and all of that. So what role do you imagine that cultural institutions have in this moment?
Definitely. Cultural institutions have a undeniable duty to tell the truth. You know, this is where the fake news come into play because I have a statement that I also use is that when you write something, everyone has visited the beach at one time. And as a kid, when you go to the beach, you'll draw stuff in the sand, right? And if you stay there long enough, the waves will come in and whatever you wrote in the sand will wash away. That means it never existed, you know, to some people, even though it was there, to the person that comes behind you, it never existed. So they'll interpret the movement in the sand to whatever story framework that they want to deliver.
Right.
But if you write it, if you etch it and sculpt it out in rock, in stone, it's very difficult for someone to come and tell you a whole nother story.
Right.
So cultural institutions have the duty to document this information, have the duty to give the truth about what exists. Where some people may say people are thugs, and other people say no, they're not thugs. They're protesting. They're God-given right. You know, they're inalienable right. They're protesting. They're not street thugs. They're protesters. Or you know, so the story and the narrative can be turned to be negative. When you think back, Nixon era, where this whole fight on crime began to play out in the national scene during the presidency, Nixon, you know, where it's a war against crime. And then Ronald Reagan came a little later and he made it even stronger with his war on drugs. These were given the green light to really attack people. Whereas now the opioid epidemic, oh, it's a sickness.
Right.
The narrative changed over a period of time. Well, back then when Nancy Reagan was saying just say no, instead of sicking the police on people that were being affected by this epidemic of drug use, they should have been creating programs. They should have been sending mental health doctors and getting people rehabilitated. So I show you those things to show the different narratives for the same issue. Cultural institutions have to do this. We have to be responsible for documenting. We have to be responsible because life imitates art. And if we're the artists and we're narrating this, eventually life will begin to take on that story. And we've seen this play out year in and year out, decade in and decade out, where this narrative changes because the way that it's being depicted in the media, the way that it's being interpreted in the print media and interpreted through exhibits and things of that nature. I just want to say this. I don't know how true it is. I haven't fact checked this, but I remember I was on social media maybe probably a month ago, and I saw it, the heading, and I may be wrong. I don't want to, because I haven't fact checked this, but they showed this museum that in I believe it was in China or somewhere in Asia that was displaying an exhibit that compared Black people to animals, and they had an animal expression, and they found a picture of a Black person with a similar expression, and the people of that country were walking through this museum looking at this. And that's what I mean by the narrative in cultural institutions. There is no way that whatever that is, I haven't done a fact check to see fully what that was, but that was the heading on it. But whatever that was, there was no way as a cultural institution that should have been allowed to be done, because that controls the narrative of people's minds. So that's what our duty is as cultural institutions, is to tell the truth, the facts of this existence.
I really appreciate that answer for so many reasons, because it also speaks to the fact that there are cultural institutions, as you suggest, that fundamentally are based on these narratives, these kind of racist narratives, right? And so even though there's nothing new in this moment, maybe this is a moment when cultural institutions finally can begin to look at themselves, and museums to look at themselves and to think through those questions. So thank you. You know, this is just amazing. I could continue to talk to you forever, but we actually are almost there. So let's go ahead and see if we have any questions. We do from our audience, unless there was anything you wanted to add before I turn.
No, I'm here. Okay. And I'm
Great.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Okay, great. So our first question is from Julio Capo, who is the Deputy Director of the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab, and I will read you his question. Okay. He says, I just want to thank Mr. Barber for his generative conversation today, and was really moved to hear about his love for this work, and especially learning that he began as an intern there. This is especially inspirational to our students and would-be students to see how this work can lead to such success. That's right. My question is about Miami specifically. So many people think of Miami as a particularly multicultural and diverse space, which is true in its own way, but it's also deeply segregated and has a long history, of course, of racial violence and inequity. I wonder if Mr. Barber can help us all understand a bit better why Miami is really important to understanding national politics, including the continued fight for Black liberation. That's a small question, Julio, but a great question.
Yeah, definitely. That is a great question. And it's interesting that he talks about historically this view of Miami. Let me just lay the groundwork for this particular question now. Miami, there's books out that say Miami are known as being South but not South. You've even had scholars that have said, well, Miami never experienced, you know, the things that we saw in Mississippi, the things that we saw in Alabama and Georgia, you know, with this racism of Ku Klux Klan and the lynching and of Black people hanging and things of that nature. And many people say Miami is South but not South. Right. And there's a reason, and this is a great way to talk about this narrative that we talk about in terms of Miami being, I've heard the expression that Miami is a salad bowl, you know. Miami, first of all, the basis of what I'm saying, and please, I don't tend to offend anybody, but I tend to speak facts. Jim Crow was a major problem here in America. And what Jim Crow did to the people of color was really, you know, separate this community between white and Black. When you look at the incorporation papers of the city of Miami in 1896, that's some 40 to 50 years after slavery ended, you know, excuse me, I'm sorry, let me refresh that myself. That was from like 15, 20 years somewhat. After slavery ended, you know, Jim Crow in the Miami documents, when they voted to incorporate the city of Miami, it had the person's name and it had whether they were white or black. As you go down that list of all the men that voted, it was their name and whether they were white or black. This was 1896. Miami, in turn, eventually, with the influx of Miami being the gateway to the Caribbean, the South American countries, Cuban exiles began to come over. Miami systematically began to change to where it wasn't whether you, because initially in Miami, you live based on your color, whether you had white toned skin or whether you were dark. Even some people from the Cuban national baseball team were not allowed to stay in downtown Miami because their skin, the hue of their skin, was too dark. And it was whether you were white or black, right? So eventually Miami had to adapt to now having not just white and black, but brown, you know, having people of Latin descent. So the thing about how do we balance this thing? Because it became white, black, and then it was Jewish. You know, then it's white, black, Jewish, and Latino, you know. And if you know, now I mentioned Jim Crow. Jim Crow was systematic. Now, Jim Crow was a bad word. It became a bad word. But what we don't understand is that Jim Crow yielded his power to his nephew. His nephew is James Esquire. So where Jim Crow was fight and we're going to sick the dogs on you, James Esquire was, we're going to write laws that systematically separate us. That's where you got the redlining coming into place. That's where you say, okay, we're going to put the black people in Color Town and write up zone descriptions that keep them in that area. We're going to write red lines to make it more expensive for you to live in this area. So why is Miami important and why people are viewing this? Miami is important because Miami has the ability to show how everybody can eventually merge. Now, why I say Miami, people say Miami is South but not South, and they try to say Ku Klux Klan did not exist here. Because Miami has always been a tourism city. When Julia Tuttle and Henry Flagler established Miami, they established it as being a tourist destination, a tropical paradise. What's the worst thing that can happen to a city that's depending on tourism dollars? Something negative in the media. Something negative. And during that time of travel, nobody wanted anything negative in the media for Miami because it's going to hurt the dollars that are coming in to support the economy. So they would whitewash a lot of activity. They did not broadcast that in the 1950s, the Ku Klux Klan, they were burying a policeman, Miami-Dade sheriff, and the Ku Klux Klan was riding in full regalia, riding police motorcycles and driving the police cars. This was in Miami, but they didn't publicize this, that the police was the Ku Klux Klan. Because if the people in the North knew that Miami was like Alabama and like Mississippi, where they were lynching people, nobody wanted to go there and spend their money. It was shown when H.T. Smith got together and they did the Mandela boycott in Miami. They had to yield. So Miami was a city that always conceded itself two things. They conceded the beach wade-in at Hollover, and instead of arresting people, which would have caught national media, they decided not to arrest anybody and give the people of color Virginia Key Beach. That was a seceding so that they don't go to legal. When they tried to protest, when Judge Johnson and Garth Reeves and Porter, and when they tried to petition the Miami Springs golf course to allow blacks to golf there on a city-owned course, they gave them, instead of arresting them, they gave them 1 day to golf. That was conceding to it so that the media don't get wind and destroy the economy. So that's why Miami is so important to this movement.
Wow, I feel like you just scratched this, or we're like over time, which we never do, but I just couldn't stop you because I feel now we're just getting started. Let me just say a humongous thank you and a wish that we continue to work with you and get your our students there to intern with you and all kinds of of good stuff moving forward.
And I must say, we have FIU students that we hired. We have one of your students, Louis Burton, who is our assistant archivist, an amazing person. We'll be doing a session later on today on what is the 4th of July to a slave, Frederick Douglass, about 2 o'clock. So join us if you can for that.
Yeah, I can, I will. Yeah, thank you.
At 1 o'clock, I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll look it up, don't worry. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, audience, for listening. And we look forward to our next conversation next week, Thursday at 10. And
thank you. Thank you so much.
Look forward to all the work together ahead.
All right.
Yeah. All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.